So what do you think about the potential for ransomware being identified as terrorism?
Terrorism, typically we define it, as something that has to have some sort of political or religious ideology behind it. Whereas like a lot of the ransomware attacks aren't, they really are profit. They're criminal.
Not terrorism. Hi, welcome back. I'm Ben Carr with Interesting Conversations in Security, and I've got Kevin O'Connor with Adlumin.
So basically I've been a geek, nerd hacker my whole life, starting out as kind of a skitty when I was a kid. I joined up with CrowdStrike for a hot minute, working in their advanced research team. And then I got to join up with Adlumin, a cybersecurity MDR, XDR product and services company, as their director of threat research.
Do you think we'll see increased enforcement of this?
Having more teeth for any sort of law enforcement agency is going to be great.
The criminals have figured out that there's an incentivization model. So why shouldn't government figure out that there's an incentivized model?
Incentivizing this, I think, is going to create an environment where there's more emphasis on discovering how ransomwares work.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Ben Carr with Interesting Conversations in Security, and I've got Kevin O'Connor with Adlumin. Kevin, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on and having a conversation with us.
Thanks. Really happy to be here, especially during Black Hat. I think this is a great time to have the talk.
Yeah, it's a interesting time for everybody, right? A lot going on with security. Everybody's trying to make, kind of waves and say what's going on new. Maybe for those who aren't familiar with you, you can talk a little bit about your background, how you got into security, and then Adlumin.
Yeah, so basically I've been a geek, nerd hacker my whole life, starting out as kind of a skitty when I was a kid, with the sub-7 virus, sending it to friends on AIM in middle school. Eventually I actually got in trouble in middle school because I bricked some of the computers there while I was like, trying to show off to the kids what I could do. And instead of, sending me before the judge, they actually put me in a program and sent me to like Columbia University on weekends to learn IT, computer repair, so we could actually help run the middle school's networks. Eventually, while I was in college, I got picked up by the NSA for summer internship programs, converted full-time, working with the National Security Agency. I'd say the pride of my career and what I like to focus on was sort of the more offensive side.
Yeah.
It was a fantastic mission there. I love the people there, some of the most talented people you'll ever meet. But it is nice to be sort of outside that. Eventually I left. I had a wife. She was like, you can't keep disappearing at 4 a.m. in the morning and I can't get a hold of you because you're in a SCIF. There's no phones. So it is nice to be out and have my cell phone. I joined up with CrowdStrike for a hot minute, working in their advanced research team, looking at some of the Russian threat actors and stuff from their perspective. And then I got to join up with Adlumin, a cybersecurity MDR, XDR product and services company, as their director of threat research, stand up their threat research efforts there. We also do some response, so we get to see a lot of how this stuff plays out in the field and, incident response engagements and stuff as well.
That's really cool, man. Great. That's a really interesting background.
Yeah, when I say it out loud, it sounds a lot cooler than, it was when you were going through it. I'll say that.
But the interesting periods are a lot shorter than the kind of long, lengthy, nothing going on here.
It's only when you string it together, you're like, okay, that could be something.
Really cool, really cool. So let's talk a little bit about ransomware and just where you see things going, right? There's been, I want to say, a lot of movement in the ransomware space, but I think everybody's seen it, right? We've seen Change Healthcare this year. We saw CDK Global, right? Stuff goes back a long time. People may have been familiar with in the past with Colonial Pipeline. It's a really big deal, right? And then I think last week, we saw kind of public announcement that largest ransomware payment ever, $75 million to a Fortune 50 company, from a Fortune 50 company.
Yeah, ransomware has continued to be the huge threat sort of on everybody's mind. The APTs and stuff are really, the sexy part of security and cyber, but that's not really the threat that most businesses face, I would say. And that really is the crime where things like ransomware, business email compromise and all that. Adlumin's definitely been very sort of attuned to this, and we've been dealing with it a lot over the past, I'd say, year especially. Working together with companies like Halcyon to, deploy enhanced monitoring and all those kind of things, and ransomware discovery, but also doing things like baking in exfiltration detection and prevention sort of at the higher levels of the operating system. So we don't work at the kernel level, kind of like Halcyon does. But that just, we're looking at a different set of logs and a different sort of insight, maybe applying some UAV type stuff in the future to identify, when there's exfiltration ahead of a ransomware attack happening.
So what do you think about the potential for ransomware being identified as terrorism, right? So we saw the Senate bill that is trying to they're trying to move forward, which would categorize it as terrorism and certain actors as terrorist groups, right? Which would, I think, elevate it to a different perspective. we've had a lot of debate on our podcast about whether it's actually is terrorism or isn't, but I think the end result is where we're trying to get to. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great step forward. We've seen a lot of action on the government's part, really, in the past year, I would say, to specifically go against ransomware. And I think that's really a result of the impact it's been having on businesses. This new funding legislation that's coming out is really interesting, right? Because it does name specifically, I think, like 18 different ransomware groups as specific targets. They're, instead of calling it like nation state supporters of terrorism, they now have this term nation state supporters of ransomware, and it allows them to be more proactive in doing things like seizing funds and going after ransomware internationally. It gives some specific extra powers, I guess, to the FBI and some other agencies like CISA and Department of Homeland Security. And I think it's only one part of a coordinated effort, but I think it's a really good step forward. Do I think ransomware is terrorism? No, I actually have an intelligence background, security and risk analysis degree. Um, and like, terrorism, typically we define it, as something that has to have some sort of political or religious ideology
Yeah,
behind it. Whereas like a lot of the ransomware attacks, aren't. They really are
they're
for
criminal,
profit. They're
not
criminal.
not
Yeah.
not terrorism, right?
Yeah. Not to say there aren't, ransomware attacks that are being, proliferated by these nation state actors and stuff. But, unless there's specific cases where they're coming out and saying, so I know like Lockbit did come out and say that they were, going after the US government after, the attempted complete takedown that sort of happened back in December, January by the FBI and DHS. So maybe that's terrorism because they're saying it's an ideology. I know we've had some groups specifically, call out going after U.S. infrastructure like the airports because of because of U.S. support to NATO and the whole issue over in Ukraine, NATO support to Ukraine. Um, so I
Yeah, I
think
think
it
those are good
could be
examples,
aligned.
right? Like if somebody's trying to support, forcing somebody to do something to support an ideology, like support for, one faction or the other in the Ukrainian conflict, or, Palestinian Israeli conflict, like those kind of things, they could definitely be affiliated with the terrorist goal.
Yeah,
But I like to equivalent it to, grand theft larceny versus murder, right? They're both criminal activities, but they had different repercussions, right, to the person that perpetrated that. And so in this case, I think uh, the elevation to terrorism seems the goal to get to be able to go after these groups, right, and impose sanctions and support and other things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's what we're trying to get to is stop the actual action itself.
yeah. What I'm really looking forward to is sort of the first case where there's a hospital that's been ransomware, which we know has happened before, and they're turning away patients, and one of the patients dies in the ambulance, during transport between somewhere that's affected by ransomware and somewhere that isn't. Is there a case then to sort of charge some of these ransomware actors with something like manslaughter, right? Because it's their fault that
Yeah,
they were able to deliver the care needed.
there was actually a study that came out that said out of statistically on average people that go into the hospital right for Medicare that on average 3 out of 100 people will pass away right but in a ransomware event it's 4 out of 100 right and so interestingly enough like that doesn't seem we've talked about it before again it doesn't seem like a big change right 3 to 4 but it's a 33% increase in
Yeah,
the
I
death
mean
numbers,
that's
right?
something that's
That's
probably
pretty impactful.
significant by
Yeah,
statistical.
yeah. So, I just, I'm just wondering how we get out of this cycle, right? Because it just seems like the motivation is monetary, and there hasn't really been a lot of movement to actually long-term change, long-term impact to the problem. Where and certainly Halcyon is out there trying to look at the preventative problem, how to address it if somebody does get ransomed, but long term, like how do we actually get out of the cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to have to be sort of a multi-phased approach, right? I think things like the bill you're seeing that was proposed, and increasing action by U.S. government and foreign governments, right? We've also seen some of this done in collaboration with the UK, Australia, is going to help, but it's not going to be a cure-all, right? A lot of these ransomware actors are operating out of overseas territories with not friendly relations with Western
Yeah,
nations,
the
right?
jurisdictional problem is really
Yeah.
hard to solve, right?
So, I mean, there's only so much you can do other than cutting maybe Russia off from the internet, right? So these people can't. But even then, right, they're redirecting through networks. So okay, they go through China, which is a friendly country, and then from China they hit the US. So it's not there's no way to easily stop it. So I think um personally, I think we have to look at the fundamentals of how operating systems and how we use like networks and resources today might need to change, right? Like there are things like fileless operating systems, right? Where uh, you know, for what most people are doing day to day on computers in the business environment is really limited to just a couple apps and web browsing. So why not use, these thin clients to provide, a separate browsing terminal that can then, link some data like a clipboard over to, a second sort of service that's just running the applications that they're using, and then tying in really strong sort of, access analytics to these specific files and resources so that, you can identify when things are going wrong.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of companies are struggling with this because they just don't even have the resources to be able to approach the problem, right? Like, there's still tons of companies out there that don't have really good security teams. They don't have a CISO in place. I mean, even till recently, like, there's Fortune companies that don't have, CISOs in place. So, like, how do companies that don't have those resources, how do they actually get a handle on the problem?
So the good news, the bigger the company, I would say the bigger the target for ransomware. But it still is a very big problem for even small and medium businesses, which, like you said, don't have the resources. I think that's why we need to start looking towards these MDR and XDR products that can automate like a lot of the cybersecurity stack, sort of into like a single pane of glass that can then be actioned and monitored by maybe their IT service provider if they have one, or maybe even them themselves, right? Outsourcing things like SOCs, to private companies that specialize in it, right? Like, uh, you know, any business hires out or contracts out, specific specializations. So why should cybersecurity be, different than accounting, right? It's something that needs to happen, I think, because it is such a risk, and it poses, not only reputational damage, availability issues, but also potentially compliance issues too, right? Um, I know like the state of Maine, California have been very progressive in terms of like reporting requirements for when data is breached for its citizens. But I think we're going to continue to see that spread. We've already seen SEC impose like reporting requirements. We've seen ransomware actors threaten to tell the SEC that they've actually breached victims so that they can, be faced with fines and stuff like that in an effort to help force them to pay out these ransoms. Um, so I think there's a lot going on.
Do you think we'll see increased enforcement, right, of this? And, like, have you followed anything about, Supreme Court recent decisions that, like, take some of that ability of agencies to actually enforce regulation unless it's specifically called out in the regulation? What's your thought about the long-term impact of that? Like, are we gonna have a difficult time moving forward because
Yeah.
regulation is really hard?
I mean, I think having more teeth for any sort of regulatory or, law enforcement agencies is going to be great. A lot of the problem is organizations like CISA that are cybersecurity focused, their mandate doesn't necessarily extend to, small private businesses and stuff. They're more focused on critical infrastructure, things like that, which not all businesses are. So I think being able to expand sort of what's under the purview of these organizations is going to be good in helping secure them. Um, I think there's also been a lot of efforts by folks like the State Department. I don't know if you saw while we're here at Black Hat, but one of the big, billboard signs outside the electronic ones actually has a advertisement by the Department of State saying like, cybersecurity is critical to democracy or something, supporting critical infrastructure. Sort of like if you know something, report it for a $10 million bounty. And I think it has like,
I wish I knew
contact
something.
information. I know. I mean, but that's the thing, right? Incentivizing this, I think, is going to create an environment where, there's more emphasis on discovering how ransomware is working, right? Because
Well, it's interesting because
yeah,
the criminals have figured out that there's an incentivization model, right? So why shouldn't, the government figure out that there's an incentivized model, right, to support goals that they're trying to achieve?
and you had mentioned, right, there was recently supposedly the largest payout from a ransomware activity. I think it was, I don't think we know who the victim was specifically,
No,
but
it's supposedly in the Fortune 50,
yeah,
but $75 million.
but through blockchain
Yeah.
tracking and stuff, it was $75 million. And I think it was tied to a group. Um, I can't remember the Ghost something maybe. Ghost, right? It wasn't one I actually heard of, but again, it just goes to show that like it doesn't have to be a Black Bast, Lockbit or something like that. There's a lot of groups out there.
So going back to a point we talked about earlier, we talked about the Senate bill, where they're actually listing out some of the groups. I think one of the follow-ups I want to have, which you brought back, so thanks, is if they're actually naming groups, right? One of the things we've seen in the ransomware side is that they'll shut down and turn on with another name, right? So legislation can be problematic because sometimes it's slow to respond, right? And the cycle of actually having, again, something defined specifically in legislation and, it's Black Bassett, but tomorrow it's something else. that then becomes a problem from a legislative and a regulatory side, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would say it absolutely does, and we see this across industries, right, where legislation is slow to follow what's actually happening in private sector and, actually in the real world. Um, and absolutely, these ransomware groups will, spin down and then stand up with a new one. I think even Lockbit was tied to some of the earlier ransomware groups and developers as well, some of the software. And it's hard, even when you're like looking at these files. I've done a lot of malware analysis. Like, it's not easy to say that like this piece of software,
Oh, the attribution is
yeah,
super hard. Yeah.
attribution is hard, and linking them between groups is hard, right? Like sometimes you might get lucky, but even then your confidence might not be 100%. Um, so yeah, I mean, keeping them down by naming these groups, I don't think is necessarily going to be an effective way.
And I think that's even it will even be more highlighted by the Chevron ruling, right, which we started to talk about. So that Chevron ruling, if you're not familiar with, basically initially gave the agencies a lot of leeway, right? If the legislation wasn't clear. Supreme Court ruling has now kind of taken that away, and I think that there's a lot of impact potentially on the cyber side, which maybe didn't a lot of people didn't initially think about. But in this case, that's a great example of if the legislation says it's only these 18 groups, the agency wouldn't have the ability to kind of take that and say, yes, but these groups have just morphed into someone else.
Yeah, I think that's why like they're designating things like state sponsors of ransomware so that, any group that they then tie back to one of these state sponsors can then maybe, also be designated through that sort of language. Um, it's just a really crazy environment right now. One of the most interesting things that we had seen was, like I had mentioned earlier, was the ransomware group specifically calling out that they were going to start notifying like legislators and regulatory, enforcement agencies that they've compromised people, right?
Yeah.
So it goes to show that they're actually relying on some of the controls being put in place.
Yeah, this came after the SEC guidance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's actually scary from the like legal rulings recently was the case with the SolarWinds CTO,
Yep.
right? Where he's being held
CISO.
personally, was it the CISO?
Yeah.
Where he's being held like personally liable, right? And I think things like actions like that, which do scare me from a liability perspective, as somebody in cybersecurity and offering services. But I think, something like that can go a long way in helping drive these organizations to affect change within themselves to protect themselves from ransomware, right? You're not helpless. There's things you can do, right? Everything from like, credential compromise monitoring to, Halcyon type solutions, at the kernel level, looking for, new ransomware trends and anomalous things to bandwidth monitoring to make sure they're not stealing, your
Yeah.
data and selling
I,
it back to you.
I think, companies, executive staff, like C-level execs, right, across the board, not just security, not just the CISO of the board, they have to become more aware of the problem state, right? I mean, cyber is typically their number one risk, but we often see that they're just not putting the focus on it. And so I think you've got to be more aware of this because we're going to see more enforcement action on agencies, and we're going to see potentially more, legal action from investors.
Yeah. And I mean, the number of high profile ransomware type events, has only continued to grow, right? Starting with things like Colonial Pipeline, all the way up to what had just happened in the automobile sector, where, like individual dealerships across the country couldn't conduct business over the weekend and longer because, a main service provider had been ransomwared. There was a big issue with one of the infrastructure infrastructure providers for a bunch of community banks that also had issues, right? Where all these community banks across the country were sort of down because some common provider, third party supplier had a ransomware incident. Things like this happen.
Yeah, so we talked about critical infrastructure, and I guess that raises the question of, does critical infrastructure, is that really even a thing anymore, right? Or given kind of this third-party risk relationship and the reliance on, potentially a small startup to have impact on a very large organization or, in a Change Healthcare side, some back-end company that we've never heard about, right? One might consider that a hospital or United Healthcare, something like those things we are aware of those names. Chase, Citibank, we're aware of those names. They're obviously part of that critical infrastructure play, but they've got a lot of suppliers, right? Like,
Yeah.
is almost everything on the tech side like a critical infrastructure component
I
now?
mean, just like the internet where everything's sort of connected in a web, that's really how it plays out in real life, right? So critical infrastructure originally, right, there is a specific designation.
Yeah, there's a definition
To
of it.
cover it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but like you would think it's the traditional, like, power, healthcare, the critical services
Yeah,
response.
utilities,
Yeah.
financial, yeah.
But honestly, it extends back to again, the banks and like you said, what about the banks providers, right? The person who's hosting all their VMs in a private cloud somewhere. What happens when they get ransomware? Are they considered critical infrastructure when we can't make, charges and stuff like that on our cards? It really expands to almost everything. Is, your dentist's office critical infrastructure? I mean, it is for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%, right? Like, if you've got a cracked tooth,
Yeah.
that's important for you that day. Yeah, it's really hard to figure out where, I mean, and then, you even think about, like, when you're trying to fix this problem and go after the individuals, there's no real boundaries, right? I mean, the UK is actually looking at potentially, not allowing for payments for ransomware. But if you're a multinational organization and you've got a presence in the UK, does that then affect you? Doesn't it affect you? Do you pay the ransom for everybody outside? Like,
Yeah.
it's almost that these borders and boundaries kind of cease and go away. And we're thinking about these on real old school terms.
I always get asked this question by folks, and it's like, do we pay? Do we not pay? And I honestly, my decision flips depending on the day and what the circumstance is and what the practicality is. But I think in a perfect world, we would see, something like the government enforcing a non-payment policy, only because that's the way to really stop this at the root, right? When it's no longer profitable, it won't happen anymore, right? When people are no longer making money from this, it's not going to happen. And you can, mitigate the impact of ransomware not only through detection and discovery and prevention, but even having secure, immutable offline backups that can't be ransomware, right? Being able to recover your services or having, infrastructure that's resilient enough to, survive, portions of a ransomware attack, lowers your need to pay other than the data that they may have stolen. And that's really why I think we see most businesses paying. Um, but it's an inevitability. And more we see these ransomware actors still, even though they've taken payment, they'll still come back and hit up the victim,
Yeah, the
vendor, right?
extortion, the multi-tiered extortion, they'll go after their vendors, they'll go after their suppliers, their
Right. So you've already spent 75 million. Of course, they're going to come back, in 5 years when they want more for another 5 million.
Yeah, and the statistics show that if you pay, you're much more likely to be attacked again,
Yeah.
and then, the result of where does this all
And we see them reselling the data to other, ransomware as a service brokers and stuff like that so that they can, use it for initial access in their own follow-on attacks. We did an incident response where there were 2 different instances of people using ransomware as a service. I think it was like the Play ransomware. And it was definitely, obviously, 2 different threat actor groups working in the network, because we responded to one that was triggered when a sysadmin got a message, on his Microsoft Teams saying "Hey, you got a problem, go check out these systems." And while in the course of that investigation, we discovered that there was already another group that had been sitting there and siphoning off data using the same, Play ransomware tools and techniques. So it was interesting because it was sort of, one was low and slow and one was quick and noisy. And the low and slow one are the people who actually had the data and everything. Whereas the quick and noisy never really got past just ransoming, disabling a couple different boxes.
Yeah, and that's the business model right now, is it's ransomware as a service, right? They have elevated that. You've got the people who get the access, the people who enable the currency, the people who actually provide the infrastructure as a service to run these attacks, right? It's fully staffed help desks, right? Service desks, call centers. It's crazy what this has actually become.
Yeah, and honestly, one thing that I've seen a lot, especially, working in threat research and stuff, and I like to see sort of what's going on in the broader network environment, is I think there needs to be more pressure put on these service providers and these owners of these ASNs hosting infrastructure that's being used in these ransomware attacks. I mean, when you go look up who owns a certain IP space that's hosting, a malware C2 server, you'll see the big players, see Cloudflare, Amazon, and those people are cooperative. They'll help, take down these sort of ransomware exfiltration sites and all that. But then you get these no-name providers that I don't know how long they've been around. I don't want to name names, but if you go through the list of registered ASNs, you're going to see providers with comic book references. You're going to see companies you'd never heard of, companies that are been acquired 3 times over with small IP spaces that are being used over and over again for these types of attacks. I mean, it's at the point where just based on the ASN the traffic is sourced from, you can say it's a lot more likely to be sketchy. And I'd say that's worrying, and they're not cooperative. We've reached out to them to try to get these things.
Well, there's no incentive
No,
to
there's no
cooperate,
incentive.
right? I
Yep.
mean, it's really hard to go after them. Sometimes again, we've talked about jurisdictional issues, right? Make it really difficult to track people down. So, yeah, when there's money behind it, it's really easy to abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I really want to thank you. It's been a great conversation about ransomware, what's going on in the criminal side, and yeah, your thoughts on it. So I appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, I love being here. I love the conversation. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.